We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Hey Andrew, good to see you. How have things been?
Busy. I'm currently waiting on the judgment of Judge Gertrude Collins Rice in the Royal Courts of Justice case against Hancock.
Right. Well, I think that's a good place to start, talking about Hancock, COVID, and all that stuff. You were one of the first people that I definitely saw that really spoke out against COVID vaccines in general. How did that all come about? You were obviously an MP at the time, a Conservative MP. When did you start to question the vaccine? Was it right from the start, or did it come a bit later?
No, I actually took 2 AstraZeneca myself. They fooled me, and I had some side effects from that. I watched the way that scientists who raised concerns about lockdowns or any aspect of the pandemic response, particularly the vaccines, were treated. And that is not the way science works. Science is always open to question, things should be challenged. And I didn't like anything that I saw. I saw people being cancelled. My concerns about the vaccines, everything I read was confirming it, and the attitude of the government not to want to be open and transparent and to listen to criticisms and concerns and give proper answers only confirmed my suspicions. And they festered until December 21 when I spoke against Plan B and the Christmas lockdown then. And I voted against the masking, the mandates for the masking and the NHS mandates. In fact, I voted against everything and spoke against it. And then I found out about Partygate and I realised that people in number 10 who'd got access to all the science weren't taking it seriously. And then I sort of kept my powder dry until autumn 2022, when the government decided they're being petitioned by the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency to authorise the experimental vaccines for children down to 6 months of age. And so since no healthy child of that age had died of COVID, and knowing that the severe adverse events were from the Pfizer and Moderna's own sort of trial papers, at least 1 in 600, but I also knew that the vaccine that was given out to the public wasn't the vaccine that gained emergency use approval. It was a completely different vaccine, which was effectively untested, probably 5 times more dangerous than the one that was approved. I decided that I wasn't going to stand by and see young children in the UK damaged by an experimental vaccine which was going to be no use to them. So I went round to colleagues, explained the situation. Some of them admitted they'd actually had heart attacks themselves after 2 doses of Pfizer. And to a man and a woman, every one of them refused for some reason to speak out. So I stood up on my own on the 13th of December, managed to get a debate, questioned the efficacy and safety of the vaccines, which stopped the government from being willing to authorise them for the small children. But that sealed my fate. I was ostracised immediately by colleagues. I had then spent 19 months eating every meal on my own in Parliament, no one talking to me, just for raising legitimate questions, which again, that only confirmed that something was seriously wrong. I was expelled from the Conservative Party on very spurious grounds, and Matt Hancock and the Prime Minister at the time, Rishi Sunak, sought to smear me as an anti-Semite for tweeting that my view as a tweet where I said that as a world-leading cardiologist said to me, the rollout of the mRNA COVID vaccines is the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust.
I mean, when you were going through this phase, when you're asking these questions, regarding the vaccine, and it's clear that it's causing division amongst the party. Was it any of the fellow MPs, colleagues that maybe secretly agreed with you? I find
Well,
it.
there were some willing to ask a few questions, but not really, not willing to call for any halt to the rollout of the vaccines. I got, I think, the first debate on excess deaths in any parliament in the world, but it took me 9 months of petitioning, when we were getting thousands of excess deaths every week.
Right.
You're only allowed to put in for a debate once a week, and only on sitting weeks. And I put in for 26 weeks, and with the summer holiday, that was 9 months
Mm.
before I managed to get a debate on excess deaths, something that was affecting every constituency in the country, every community. And we shouldn't have been having excess deaths. We'd supposedly had a pandemic where we'd had excess deaths.
Yeah.
And after a time of that, we should have less than expected deaths for a while until things level out. But we didn't. We just had constant excess deaths. And I also did research in the summer of 2023, before I got my date for my October debate on excess deaths, into what happened with thalidomide. And that was fascinating. And I produced a little video, which you can view on YouTube, Andrew Bridgen, YouTube, and it's called Thalidomide, the True Story. And that was a drug produced by a German company called Chemie Grunethal, who actually recruited former Nazi scientists into their scientific department. Their lead scientist was a guy called Heinrich Mulke, who'd been indicted for war crimes,
Wow.
but never got prosecuted. He produced a drug called thalidomide. The company had given it out for free before they marketed it. They gave that for free to their staff. And an employee's wife took it while she was pregnant and gave birth to a child with no ears. But they covered that up and still moved it forward. As we know, thalidomide crossed the blood placenta barrier, went into the baby, unborn baby, and it's prevents angiogenesis, which is the formation of blood vessels. And depending on how much the mother took and what stage of gestation the fetus was at, that was the disabilities. But about half of the babies died, and half were born with life-changing disabilities. And the drug was actually withdrawn in 1961. And shockingly, the word thalidomide was never mentioned in a debate in the House of Commons until 1972, 11 years later, before compensation was started to be. And Grunethal had an injunction on the Times newspaper to stop them talking about writing about harms from the drug.
Right.
That was lifted by the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights, I think. 3 judges there in their judgment said that speakers of the House of Commons had deliberately suppressed all debate and questions on thalidomide for 11 years. I sent that video to the current Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, asking again for a debate on excess deaths and pointing out that we didn't want history to repeat itself, did we?
Mm.
Mysteriously, after that, he found me a debate within 3 weeks.
Wow. I just what I find really interesting is the lack of support that you got from your colleagues and peers. Were they not also asking these questions? Did they not sit there and think, oh, like this is
There
and
were some questions about the level of compensation being paid for those who were claiming injury, but and it was interesting because I went to all the media as well. Obviously, every media, every national media and some international are represented in the lobby in Parliament. All the journalists are there from the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky, the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, everything. And I knew them very well, and nobody was interested. And some of them told me privately if they were to write about my concerns about the vaccines, they'd lose their jobs.
crazy.
So much for having a free press, and that all reminded me of an event more than 10 years previous where I'd exposed the Post Office Horizon scandal, where a dodgy software had caused 1,000 people to be criminally convicted when they hadn't stolen any money. And yeah, that was exactly the same, because I had all the evidence that they were all in, well, the convictions were unsafe, certainly by 2014. But again, I went around all the media, and I even told them, you run this story, you'll get an award, because here's all the evidence. These people are innocent, or their convictions are certainly unsafe. Nobody would run it. And then 10 years later, a docudrama is made, and there's a public outcry. Well, everything that was in that docudrama I'd said in the House of Commons more than a decade earlier. No one had listened.
Why do you think they didn't report this? Why do you think the fellow MPs didn't take these concerns seriously? What do you think is behind them not, essentially reporting this?
I've come to the unpalatable conclusion that they're compromised. I mean, if you've had two heart attacks yourself, and you admit it to me in November 2022, and I'm asking you to stand with me and stop the government from inflicting the same medicine onto little babies, and you don't, well, you don't deserve a place in the House of Commons. And it was a very, very senior colleague, someone I thought was my friend, and it was mind-blowing. And the number of people, I had another colleague who came to me and said that her sister had taken the Moderna booster and was paralysed from the neck down. And I said, I'm very sorry, but you'll have to stand with me and talk about the vaccines now. You know for sure. You've got a duty to do so. And she said that her sister was a nurse and had been coerced into taking it. And now she was paralysed. She was at the mercy of the NHS. And as my colleague said to me, and you know how vindictive the NHS are with whistleblowers, I can't speak out, Andrew. I said, well, you don't have to mention your sister. You've got 100,000 constituents. You'll have plenty of emails about this. Don't mention your sister. But you've got to speak out. And she never did. She walked away.
Well, you could argue a lot of them, they almost they suffer the consequences in the election shortly afterwards, and it feels really difficult and surprising that so many of these people who have been elected got these
I
positions.
went to the Labour Party. I even went to the Labour Party and explained everything to them.
Yeah.
And I was told from the message from the Labour Party was, we're not taking on Big Pharma. They were quite happy to sacrifice their own constituents to a dangerous, untested drug, and even the children. And that's very, very bad.
What about these colleagues now? Have you spoken to them like since everything that's happened? Because it seems as if you were kind of proven right. Like if there was any questions then of the validity of
Well,
your
if I was proven right, why are they still being administered to people? I've met people who've taken 9 now.
crazy.
9. And every time, the real serious adverse event rate is probably about 1 in 120. And if you've had 9, I mean, you're playing Russian roulette 9 times with your life.
Crazy. I mean, so after this happened, after you came out and you made these kind of questions on the vaccine, was it quite clear that you thought your time within the Conservative Party, your time as an MP, your time in this?
Yes, but I went to a very senior colleague, explained everything, and I also knew that his sister, because his sister's best friend, one of the very close friends, had told me that his sister had had 2 doses of Pfizer and had to go to hospital with chest pains. So he knew, but I didn't tell him that. I explained everything. I also explained about the use of midazolam and morphine in the early stages of the pandemic, which I believe euthanized a lot of vulnerable elderly people who were in hospital, and they were all put down as COVID deaths to increase the fear, so that people would take the experimental vaccine. I had an hour and a half talking with him, and at the end, I asked him, "Would you support me?" And he gave me the party line, which was that there is currently no political appetite, Andrew, for your. This is in January 23. There's currently no political appetite for your views on the vaccines, Andrew. There may be in 20 years' time, and you're probably going to be proven right then. Well, that wouldn't have saved the babies, would it? And it's all too reminiscent of what I'd uncovered had gone on with thalidomide. And he also went on to say that However, if you decide to carry on, you've got to bear in mind that you're taking on the most powerful vested interest in the world, with
Mm.
all the personal risk for you which that will entail, which is probably almost certainly true, but that sounds almost like a threat.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And I said, well, that's it. I'm out. I'm out. I don't want to be part of this. Um,
What's your
so,
take on what's going on in America now? Because you've got somebody like RFK Jr. who's been
yeah,
questioning all this stuff, and he's in power, and he seems to have been able to find his way into that position. Like, he's spoke about this,
he's a good man.
and he's
He's a
done
good
amazing.
man. When I was expelled formally from the Conservative Party in about April 2023, not one of the colleagues I'd served in Parliament with for 12 years contacted me.
Not a
That
single
was
one.
it. Not a single one.
Wow,
But within an hour on my mobile phone, I got a call from a presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy Jr., rang me personally and said he would back me. And that was good.
incredible. It'd be interesting to see,
And I
had
think he's a very good man. And also, he's appointed, his appointment is pending for the head of the NIH. He'll be the replacement effectively for Anthony Fauci. He's an excellent man called Dr. Jay Bhattacharya.
yeah,
I've met him. He's really good. I've got faith in Robert Kennedy Jr. I think they're going to suspend the mRNA vaccines and release the record level data from America within weeks, and then that will send a tsunami of truth and across the Atlantic, which will stop the vaccines. I mean, I don't know if you saw last week the Slovak scientists who've been. He's an MP and a doctor and a scientist. He'd been tasked by the Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico to investigate the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and the pandemic response and all the corruption. He came out and said that they're not safe, not effective, they should be stopped straight away. He was sending the data off to Robert Kennedy. And he also said that because of the contamination, the DNA contamination in the mRNA jabs, in which some of the vials, he found there was more DNA in there than there was RNA, more contamination than there was mRNA. He said that the risk of that genetic material, which included the DNA sequence coding for the spike protein, he said that would have impregnated itself into some people's own DNA, which means that they will be still producing spike protein and will produce. If that's gone into a germline cell, that means that they'll be always producing spike protein with all the side effects. And he suggested that was a real cause of long COVID. And I've also seen a report from America with Dr. Pierre Corey, who's another friend of mine, a great campaigner. He's got a nurse who was first vaccinated on the 20th of December 2020. She's still producing spike protein now, over 1,500 days after her vaccination. There is only really one explanation for that.
I mean, it's just deeply concerning. What I think a lot of people are unhappy with is if the Conservative Party and even Labour came out and said, look, we made some serious mistakes during COVID, during that period. We supported some really projects that we made, clearly mistakes on. We're going to seriously investigate everything that we've done. We're going to investigate the vaccines, we're going to investigate the efficiencies of lockdowns, how good, bad. But it just seems as if neither of them want to even start that conversation, which
They
is
don't, and I complained to the government. I mean, my seat was the happiest place to live in the Midlands, highest economic growth in the country. And I watched during lockdowns, the suicide rate was going to more a month than we normally had in a year. And when I spoke to the government and raised it in Parliament, they said that there was no link between lockdowns and suicide rates. Well, we ended up with over 1 million in the country, over 1 million under 25s in need of mental health support after the lockdowns. And they're claiming it didn't lead to a rise in suicides. That's absolutely preposterous, an outright lie.
100%.
It certainly did in my constituency.
100%. And I think for me, I was the one of the things I really, from the get-go, I just didn't like the idea of lockdowns, apart from the first 2 weeks when they did it. But I think there was a really good study where they showed in May 2020 how that was the record low people getting cancer. It was the unrecorded data that was record low. And I remember thinking that is absolutely terrible news because cancer is still alive. It's just people are so scared to go to the GP over
Well,
a
of
vaccine.
course, another side effect of the vaccines, as I pointed out years ago, will be increased cancer rates, because I genuinely believe that those vaccines damage your immune system. And the more vaccines you have, the more your immune system's damaged. Well, that's the immune system. We all get cancer every single day and our body sorts it out. We always have rogue cells, but our own body's immune system sorts it out. Well, anything that damages your immune system or even occupies it. So if you're producing lots of spike protein, your immune system's fighting that. It's like you've only got so much of an army. If your army's occupied all the time fighting guerrillas, you can easily be invaded. And that's exactly what's happened to people who've taken the vaccines, unfortunately. And anything that interrupts or damages, reduces the effectiveness of your immune system, leaves everybody more prone to cancer, unfortunately. And I've got so many friends who've got cancer. And in fact, I'll let you into a little bombshell. In February 23, after I'd already been speaking out for months about the vaccines, a cabinet minister came up to me in the corridor in the House of Commons, put his arm round me and whispered into my ear, Sunil, Andrew, you can speak out about the vaccines all you want to. You're vaccinated. You're going to be dead of cancer soon. That's what he said to me.
Wow.
These are not good people.
And I think it blows so many people's minds that they're so obsessed with keeping the power the state is rather than just literally almost
What are they scared of, or what have they got on them that they have to be willing to sacrifice their own constituents' lives, their relatives' lives? I mean, that's two MPs who wouldn't speak out to protect their own family. One I know who wouldn't speak out to protect himself. He'd had 2 heart attacks. Another MP's wife came to me and said, I told him not to have them. Now he's got a heart condition. And he came to me and said, oh, okay, I'm going to speak out. He never did. He
Do,
never did.
do you think, Andrew, this is, I not so much with the vaccine stuff, but I definitely saw with, I've had the luxury of meeting quite a few MPs in my time, Conservative MPs, and I've always left a lot of the time thinking that there's a serious lack of principles and values within some of these MPs. That when you talk to them about like just generally their basic principles and values, it doesn't seem to be like what I imagine a
It's clear that the party itself didn't want people to talk about vaccine harms and excess deaths. But I mean, there has to be a limit to party loyalty,
Mm,
and I was pushed past that when I was in a position where I could speak out and stop them inflicting those injuries on small children. I don't know what sort of person wouldn't, but no one would stand with me.
do you think that's because of the lack of principles and values? That's my point. Do you think they have that they don't have?
Well, they did some pretty awful things to me. I was ostracised. Economically, I've been attacked. Lawfare against me, and half of that I think was to punish me for speaking out, and half of it was to intimidate people who might have thought of speaking out and saying, well, you don't want to end up like Andrew Bridgen, do you?
Right.
Who nobody speaks to and has to eat all his meals on his own. And I would say that intrinsically, most MPs are not very brave. They're very risk averse. And, when the herd is going in that direction, it takes a bit of courage to go in the other direction. And also, there are not many scientists. Fortunately for me, a long time ago at Nottingham University, I studied biological sciences with biochemistry, specialising in genetics, virology, and behaviour. There isn't anybody in Parliament probably better qualified to talk about the vaccines than me. And obviously, if you can speak with some knowledge, you have more, you have more conviction and you're more confident. But that still doesn't. I mean, I gave plenty of speeches explaining all the facts. Now, when you speak in the House of Commons, if if someone alleges you've misled the House, i.e. you've spoken things that aren't correct, and I gave some speeches for 40 and 50 minutes about the vaccines with lots. I always read the speeches because I needed them to be, all the figures to be absolutely spot on. Yeah? I was never asked to correct the record. And that means what I said was true. And they couldn't challenge it. That's why they had to cancel me. So from the moment I spoke out on the 13th of December 2022, stop them jabbing the babies, basically the mainstream media would never put me on any programme. I used to be on TV a lot, on the radio and in the papers, nothing good. Anyway, I remember the last interview I had with the BBC was the day after. And they asked me why I was willing to sacrifice my career on the hill of vaccine harms. And I said that's because that's the hill you're killing my people on.
I mean, do you think, you're talking about how speaking out ostracized you. Do you think that's similar to what's happening to maybe Rupert Lowe now with reform?
Absolutely, but on a different issue about deportation of illegal migrants. And there is a clue in that. They're called illegal migrants. They shouldn't be here. They've broken into our country. Yes, exactly. That's and one of the things about Parliament is it's supposed to be that any MP can speak without fear or favour. In fact, you have to speak without fear or favour to fulfil your duties. Well, I mean, I think I've demonstrated there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of favour. I mean, I was offered in January 22, after I spoke out in the December 21 against the lockdowns and everything, I was offered a bribe of anything I wanted in the world. You can have what you want. Just tell us what you want. And I was shocked. And I said, well, what do you mean? And what are we doing? I said, is that the game we're playing then? And they said, yes, that's the game we're playing. I said, well, in that case, if that's the game we're playing, I want the Prime Minister's resignation letter. Can I have that? And they said I couldn't. So I said I didn't want anything else. And quite honestly, I think my card was probably marked when I wouldn't take the bribe. I wonder how many MPs did. That's what worries me.
Well, I think it's you've clearly exposed a lot of the MPs and what happened in the last election and some of the ones currently. Do you think are you seeing any lessons being learned with either the Conservative or Reform?
No, we're not, because what we're seeing is they're doing exactly the same on a different issue to Rupert Lowe. He's speaking his truth without fear or favour. Some views that people will disagree with, but that's politics.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people do agree with him, but they wouldn't be allowed to have a voice, and that's wrong. That can never. When anyone says about anything, whether it's net zero or the vaccines or lockdowns or any issue, that it's all settled. We're not having any debate about this. The narrative is settled. I mean, that should just be a huge red flag, because quite honestly, politics and science don't work like that. They never should. Everything. And also, I mean, the only thing you have to protect from scrutiny is lies. The truth doesn't need protecting. It can defend itself. It's there.
Yeah. I think the moment you stop letting people ask questions, that's when you straight away have to question even more.
What sort of society are we living in then? That's a totalitarian dictatorship, isn't it? Which is, some of the laws that have been brought in, the number of people that have been given criminal records and sent to prison for expressing their opinions on social media. I mean, 3,000.
Crazy.
In the UK, where and Keir Starmer will say to President Trump that we pride ourselves on our freedom of speech in the UK. Well, we may have done in the past, but I think it's worn very thin over the last 5 years, and it's getting rather worse.
Well, we've had more. I think last year we had more social media arrests than Russia, which is absolutely.
We had 10 times more. They arrested 300.
Crazy.
We had 3,000, and bear in mind their population is more than twice ours.
Crazy. So going back to Rupert Lowe and what's going on with Reform, I saw earlier your tweet towards Richard Twice. What is the situation with Reform? You will know probably better than most in terms of what happened.
Yeah, I've known Nigel for more than 10 years, and I've known him pretty well. We've spoken on the same stage. I've had dinner with him many times. We used to converse on the phone probably once a fortnight for half an hour. When I'd exhausted everyone in Parliament, in January 23, I actually went to Nigel and said, Nigel, I want you to put your political weight behind this issue, and between us, we can definitely stop them jabbing the babies. And he listened, and in front of witnesses, after a half an hour speaking to him, he turned around to me and said, Andrew, I'm not speaking about the vaccines, and if you know what's good for you, you won't either. And that wasn't what I wanted to hear. That wasn't what I wanted to hear.
Did he give a reason why? Did he say why he wasn't going to speak against it?
No. He walked off after that. That is not. Well, there is a word for that, I think, and that's called cowardice. That's the opposite of leadership, as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think that's what's happening again? Similar with Rupert Lowe, he didn't necessarily.
Well, I've already told you. I think that my colleagues, a lot of my colleagues in the House of Commons in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, are compromised or scared, and I would put, obviously, Nigel Farage was in the same boat. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you ask questions about, before we start jabbing 6-month-old babies at no risk of COVID, of dying of COVID with experimental vaccines? Why wouldn't you? The default position is you would question it, wouldn't you? Is it safe? Is it effective? Nothing. Crickets.
I feel like the public would agree with you. Like asking the question, should a 6-month-old baby take an untested vaccine? Should we do that? I feel like
we were giving them to. They were authorising them for pregnant women. I wouldn't recommend a pregnant woman took an aspirin. They were completely untested. In fact, the test that Pfizer did, 80% of the women miscarried. When you look at the data, and that was data they wanted to hide for 75 years, only came out because of an American Supreme Court judgment ruling, which forced the release of the original Pfizer documents. They released them in 50,000 document batches over many, many months, every few months, and they were analysed by a team of dedicated professionals who did it for nothing. And it was shocking, absolutely shocking. But still, no one would ask any questions. I don't know what hold Big Pharma and those that have vested in it have got over our parliamentarians. And it's not just the UK. We saw it across the world. They had got elected representatives in their thrall. It's deeply, deeply worrying.
I think that's what makes even RFK Jr. Getting this nomination even more like incredible and special, and hopefully that can be he can almost be a beacon for the rest of the world to kind of
We're relying on him. There's no doubt, and I've pointed that out to him and to Jay, that we're relying on them, because we're not going to see any questions asked in our parliament in the UK, and I'm not seeing many questions anywhere else in the world. But the truth will have to come out, and it's going to have to come out in America. And he really needs to get on with it. And I know it's going to be difficult for him, and the pressure that they must be under from lobbying from their fellow, the congressmen and the senators. But I mean, you look at how much money they've taken from Big Pharma. And something I didn't realise until I wasn't an MP anymore. You realise that anyone can make a donation to a sitting MP of any amount of money if they put down, this is to help you do your job. And the MP pays no tax on that money. So you could have £1 million from Pfizer or Moderna paid into your bank account, and you pay no tax.
Wow.
That's interesting, isn't it?
That's something that surely should be exposed going forward. You should have to declare that. I mean, that sounds fairly absurd.
No tax to pay. I mean, the rules would be you should disclose it. But I mean, if it was to, it's to help me do my job. But you can spend it how you want to. And that's where you've got people like Starmer, who's taking all those gifts. He's taken more gifts than any other MP previously, because he doesn't pay any tax on any of it.
But it just makes you wonder, if you're taking those gifts, and surely those people have something over you. Like, it's very rare you get anything in life for free.
Oh no, it was just purely, out of the kindness of their heart.
I mean, it's
you know how nice Big Pharma is. What people have got to remember, what they beguile us with, is you have to remember that those Big Pharma executives, and I met some, and I thought they were frightening people. the only fiduciary duty they have is to make profit for their shareholders. They have no fiduciary duty to supply you, me, or anybody else with safe and effective medicines. Their only duty is to make profit. And people confuse that, thinking, well, they're big pharma companies, they want to. In fact, they have a disincentive to make us better. They don't want people who are healthy. They don't make any money out of it. They make money out of people who are ill. They want them long-term ill, and they actually don't want, they haven't got an incentive to cure any illness. What they have an incentive to do is produce a medicine which treats the symptoms of that illness so that you can take it every day for the rest of your life.
Mm.
And if that medicine was actually going to give you a side effect, which meant that you might have to have another medicine which might give, that's even better. That's even better. And that's how you end up with some people you meet who are on 10, 15 medicines every day. And each one of them is never going to cure anything. All it is treating the symptoms. And what you'll find is a lot of them, the side effects from one of the medicines is causing the next symptoms, which then you have another medicine, and that's even more profitable.
Mm. I mean, it's just like a never-ending cycle of just basically taking money.
Well, I've met people who say have had 8, 9, and 10 of the COVID-19 vaccines. I mean, it's a money train. And I remember having a Zoom meeting with Pfizer executives in November 2020, just before the vaccines started being rolled out. And they were almost salivating, Sunil, when they said to me in a virtual meeting like this, you'll have to take these vaccines every 3 months for the rest of your life. And they were laughing. And I thought there's something deeply wrong with these people. It made me feel deeply uncomfortable.
I mean, the thing is, they have been exposed. I question with people why they have so much trust with Big Pharma, because if you look, they've been exposed so much in the last decade, if not longer. There's Netflix series on it. There's like there's stuff on the opioid crisis. There's so much now information. People like
OxyContin,
yeah.
Thalidomide.
So
There's so many.
why do you think people still are either listening to Big
Because
Pharma?
because Big Pharma are the biggest advertisers on mainstream media. And that's baffling. Why do they need to advertise? Because you go to the doctors, he's going to prescribe you a medicine.
Yeah.
You're not going to go and ask for, I've seen this medicine on the television, I'd like to buy some. Can I have some? No. I think that's how they buy the compliance of the newspapers and the television channels. You've got Bill Gates even had given £55 million to the BBC. Then they let him come on. And effectively, despite their no advertising policy during the pandemic, there was Bill Gates saying, no one's safe till everyone's had the vaccines. You won't be allowed out of lockdown. His vaccines. I mean, he was pushing his own products, wasn't he?
Mm.
I mean, he sounded like he was advertising to me. Of course, he dumped his stock in Pfizer in early 2023, I think, or maybe 24. And then he came out and rubbished them and said they weren't very good, those vaccines. But he'd been pushing them on television all the time until he didn't own any of the shares. And of course, Bill Gates has been filmed admitting that his return on investment on vaccines is 20 to 1.
Wow. I mean, these kind of stories are so deeply worrying. What do you think will happen next now in terms of vaccines UK wise? Obviously, you've got RFK in America doing this massive push.
I think he will establish a link between childhood vaccines and autism. In fact, the scientist in America that the American government had used for decades to debunk the autism link has come out now and said that he told them there is a link years and years ago and they just suppressed it.
Wow.
There's a lot of truth to come out. It's going to be unpalatable, but we need to know where we really stand. And the sooner that we get back to real science and the scientific method, the better. And I did say in the House of Commons 18 months ago that we need to now get the politics out of science and get some real science back into our politics to move things forward. I think there's going to be a collapse in confidence, quite rightly, and trust from the public in big pharma, scientists in general, politics, and our health service. And the only way we're going to ever get any trust back, and the proper way, is that those people who knowingly deceived for whatever reason and abuse their position of responsibility to the people got to face the harshest punishments, unfortunately. And colleagues didn't like me telling them that either in the House of Commons. They didn't like that. That's what's got to happen to rebuild trust with the public, and also to remind people who seek positions of responsibility, whether they're elected or unelected, that if you abuse that trust that the public have placed in you, you will face the harshest consequences. And that's in countries all around the world, because what you'll notice is that everyone was in lockstep. We had a pandemic strategy, which I think had been 17 years in the developing, which they threw in the bin and went with the WHO lockdowns, masking and social distancing, which there was never any science for any of that. Yeah. And the psychological harm and damage it did to people was unbelievable. I mean, you still see people occasionally walking around with the masks on. I mean, those people are scarred for life. The holes in those paper masks are 800 times bigger than the virus. I reckon I could get through a doorway that was 800 times bigger than me without too much. It'd be like using a picket fence to stop a mosquito.
Yeah. I mean, it makes. I think the thing with the pandemic, I think there's going to be lifelong consequences for children who were born and raised during the era.
And also, I honestly think, and I've taken them, so I'm not pointing any fingers, but any of us who took the vaccines will have shortened our lifespan.
But I just think what happened during the pandemic with the lockdowns and stuff, I think the long-term impact for kids, those kids who are being raised those 2-3 years, I think they're going to suffer the consequences going forward.
Well, I saw a report that the government knew before they instigated the lockdown that it was going to take at least 1 million quality life years out of the population in the UK. A million years. They knew that. They knew that before they started. That was going to be the minimum effect. 1 million quality life years will be taken away. I think it was a lot more than that.
Yeah.
We've damaged the education of the younger generation, and it's not just this country. It's been done around the world. It's almost unforgivable. And I say, we need the truth. We need justice. We need people to be held to account to make sure it can never happen again. And clearly the current system of democracy we have, where MPs are too intimidated to stand up and say the truth, and those who do are ostracised and attacked and vilified, smeared in the newspapers. The current system we've got just doesn't work. And whatever happens when this is over, and it will be over. It will be over, and the truth will come out. We must have a system that prevents anything like this ever happening again, because otherwise I won't rest.
When do you think this will come out? When do you think the truth will finally expose a lot of people?
There are many things that the truth needs to come out on, and it's not just the vaccines. There's a lot more things that are going on which they're not telling the public the truth. Net zero is another example, which I think the vaccines later this year, certainly before the end of the year, they may well try and paint Trump and Robert Kennedy and Jay Bhattacharya as some sort of lunatics in our media to try and explain why we're not doing it, but they're not. And the problem is that our mainstream media have been so complicit in so many of the deceptions that have been played on the people and the falsehoods that have been pushed to them, they can't get out of it. But then no one's watching the mainstream media anymore, are they? That's why the alternative media is becoming so popular, because people are searching out for their own facts. I think I saw GB News, a thing a few months ago. The GB News was challenging the BBC for the most watched news channel in the UK. But do you know what the numbers were they were fighting over? 73,000 at any one time out of 70 million people. I mean, that's a bad tweet, isn't it, really? It's not a very good tweet, 70,000. I mean, they're fighting over nothing. And Sky are looking to close down their UK operation because they've only got 63,000 average viewers at any one time. No one's watching it. No one's buying the newspapers. People have lost trust and faith in the mainstream media because they don't report the news. They didn't report 12 years ago. I saw them, They didn't report about the post office scandal when they could have made a difference. They refused to cover anything, no matter what evidence I showed them about the vaccine harms and the excess deaths. They didn't want to talk about that. They're completely compromised. And they will be going down with the politicians who played their part.
What do you, in terms of obviously at the moment, the Conservative Party polling pretty poorly, Reform are clearly the ones that everyone's talking about on the rise. Do you see that Reform being the sort of the next phase, or do you see like almost like an inevitable kind of?
It's a Reform in my view, are a Trojan horse. They're the release valve. I think, honestly, I suspect that they blackmailed Nigel to come back because they knew Tice hadn't got the ability to dent the Conservative vote enough to get Labour a massive majority with minimal support, which they wanted. No, I think there'll be a new party formed, and I hope that I'll be a part of it if it does get formed. A genuine alternative to the Uniparty, and I believe Reform are completely part of the Uniparty.
It's crazy because initially I didn't seem like that, but from the actions of, especially the way they've handled Rupert Lowe and some of the stuff that they've come out with now, are they trying to be more of like a centrist party? Like what is? Do you have any idea?
No, it's not. It's just that their masters are the same masters of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and there are limits to what they can say, and that is why they come out with such bizarre things. I mean, Nigel had tried 7 times previously to be an MP and failed. He didn't actually look that happy when he won, and he's not looked that happy when he's been in Parliament. Well, if, as I suspect, and if you are compromised and you're controlled opposition, it's not a happy place to be, is it? I mean, you don't really think that Rishi Sunak was running the country, do you? He wasn't running the country. And Starmer's not running the country now. Unfortunately, they're both very, very compromised people. Mr. Sunak, for instance, did you know that he effectively has control of 11% of Moderna shares? He bought them in 2016, $500 million worth. They're in an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands called Thalidomide, and he decided to give £1 billion worth of taxpayers' money when he was Chancellor to the same company, Moderna. They've built a new factory in Oxford, and he gave them contracts for 150 million doses a year for the next 10 years of their mRNA vaccines. And from the record level data we've analysed, which came out of the Czech Republic, which is 11 million vaccine records, would indicate that the most lethal of all the vaccines for COVID-19 was Moderna.
Crazy. What was your?
So they don't care, Sunil. They just don't care, do they? Because you're not going to read about it in the newspaper because the newspapers won't cover it. They don't care. What can I do?
So
I stood up and asked him questions, Prime Minister's questions about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, and he still said they're safe. Unequivocally, they're safe. I think he meant they're a safe investment.
Yeah.
Because they've got full immunity. And, look at it. They only put them into the UK with the UK government guaranteeing that any claims against them for vaccine harms and deaths were going to be paid by the UK government. And that was 4 years ago. they've gone into billions of arms. They're still on emergency experimental usage. They've never been authorised. Well, are they still experimental when we've been pushing them into people's arms for 4 years? They're either safe or they're not. Release the record level data we hold in the UK, which I asked the government to do on numerous occasions, which they refused. Well, why would they refuse? They said, well, we couldn't anonymise them. Well, that's easy because the Czech Republic did.
Yeah.
All you do is take the names out, leave the date of birth, and you can even leave the month of birth and the year of birth, and that's fine. And if they've sadly died, then you put the time of death, the date of death, and it's the fact that they've refused tells you everything, and the fact that the manufacturers are still demanding that they have immunity from prosecution for the harms of their products. What other product could you put out there where you're not liable if your product harms somebody? The government picks up the tab. I mean, it's beyond belief. And now, in India, obviously, they had their own vaccine called Covishield, which is effectively a version of the AstraZeneca jab. It's being manufactured in India. And Pfizer went to the Indian government and said, we'd like to import the Pfizer jab, because the Indian population is the sort of largest in the world now, bigger than China, biggest market for pharmaceuticals potentially going forward. The Indian government said, you can import it, but we'll have to do an independent trial of its safety and efficacy first. Can you supply the samples? And Pfizer said, we're not going to bother. Doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? That's what Pfizer said. Well, we're not bothering then. We can't have immunity from prosecution.
Well, what have so you mentioned you had a Zoom call with a big pharma. What's your interactions been with? Have you had other interactions with big pharma?
No. No, I've had a lot of interaction with a lot of scientists who've analysed a lot of data. So I've met and spoken with Robert Malone, the scientist who actually discovered the mRNA technology. And I've had 2 vaccines and they hurt me. The second one really quite badly hurt me. But Robert, he took 2 Pfizer jabs and they hurt him. And he actually said to me, I rang up, because he'd been retired for quite a few years. He rang up his colleagues who are still in the research labs and said, mRNA vaccines, how did you sort out all the problems? And they said, what problems? And then he realised they never had. And he's vaccine harmed. Asim Malhotra, the cardiologist, he had 2. He believes that they killed his father. He was also a cardiologist. And they've all suffered for speaking out. They've all been cancelled. They've been attacked in the media. Asim Malhotra was accused in the mainstream newspapers of grooming me to be an anti-vaxxer. Well, the last figures I saw for the NHS, only 17% of last autumn's booster, only 17% of NHS staff took it. So that means that 83% of the NHS staff are now anti-vaxxers, officially.
I know.
There's a lot of truth to come out, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. And I think some people who have perhaps not wanted to believe the truth, I think it's going to be very difficult for some of the truths that's going to be coming out. And I'm afraid the vaccines and the vaccine harms and what our governments have done to us is not the worst of it, unfortunately.
I think for me, you mentioned about the sort of NHS. My wife works in the NHS, and when the jab was first initiated, I didn't really know much about vaccines. I don't have any expertise on it, but she was pretty adamant that she did not want to take the jab. I couldn't really, I didn't have any idea.
She's a very clever lady. You married a very clever lady.
Yeah, she was very adamant, and
good choice.
Fortunately, they made it pretty clear that you can't work for the NHS.
Well, tell her that I voted against making her being mandated or losing her job. I voted against it, and then they had to pull it, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, that's amazing for that. I remember seeing on Sky News that doctor talking out publicly on TV basically saying, I don't want to take the jab. You're forcing me to take the jab. I don't want to take it. I'm a doctor. I've worked up to that.
It's against the Nuremberg Convention. It's against the Helsinki Agreement. It is against human rights.
Yeah.
No one can force you to have a vaccine, and they can't. You can't give informed consent if you're under coercion, and the threat of not being allowed out of your house or losing your job, that's coercion. And since when, if you want to get vaccinated with anything, you can go and do it if that's what you want to do, and you've got that freedom of choice. But I mean, if you've got a headache, you can't make me take a headache tablet, can you? And how's it going to help you? It's madness, and it's not scientific, and it's going to be exposed.
Well, let's.
And we are going to be. This is as dark as things are. The darker it gets, the nearer we are to the end. And it is a very interesting time to be alive, because you're seeing things that previous generations have never been able to see, because we've never got to the truth before. We are going to get to the truth this time. Can't let them off the hook.
Let's hope and pray it happens as soon as possible, that all that is exposed. Andrew, it's been amazing talking to you. We could carry this on for many more hours. We have like a closing kind of tradition on the show where I essentially ask you something that what you think is an unpopular opinion that you think should be popular. I think I've got an idea of what you're going to say, but just generally, what is an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular?
I would pay MPs. I would pay MPs more money, not allow them to have any external interest, but I would halve the number of MPs straight away to 325. Massive savings. I would also get rid of the House of Lords. They're no use whatsoever. And I would move the UK to a direct democracy system where people had to vote. Every 3 months, the people became the second chamber. Every 3 months, we had a referendum, and you voted on all the laws that have been proposed by your parliament, and the people had the final say. And then we will truly have democracy, because demos is the people and kratos is the power. And that would be that's the Swiss model. And it's worked for them for 150 years. They've not had a war, and their average incomes are twice that of the UK. I think we'd make better decisions, and we'd have better laws, and it would empower the people. That's what I'd do.
Interesting idea. I'm sure many people will agree with that. But thank you for your time, Andrew. It's been amazing speaking to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.